Welcome to Engage ICT. I'm Sarah Jane Crespo. There have been a number of recent challenges to books that our children are reading in the classroom, and a lot of debate is cropping up around this subject. We have a panel of experts here to discuss it, so let's get into it. Steve Mock is a longtime English teacher at East High School's IB program. Jamie Prothro is the Director of Libraries for the Wichita Public Library. And Suzanne Perez is the KMUW Education Reporter. Thank you all for joining us. Jamie, let's start with you. As a librarian, you've seen book banning come and go and evolve. When was the last time the banning of books was a big topic like it is now in the United States? Can you just kind of give us some history?
Yeah, I think really from what I recall, back in the 80s, there was a book that was published that really rocked the Kansas community. I think there was a challenge in Olathe related to the book Annie on My Mind, really one of the first LGBTQ books that was in public libraries, for example. And I remember when I first started working in libraries, that book was consistently checked out by one person. I always thought that perhaps he loved that book, but today I was actually thinking perhaps he was checking it out to keep it from others. I don't know. But I guess for the last 50 years, we've been, libraries have been really putting a lot of energy into making sure that books that are pushing society's buttons aren't banned. So there's a week every year in September that the American Library Association promotes called Banned Book Week. That doesn't mean that only in that week we read or celebrate provocative titles, but it's something that we do every day of our existence to make sure that the freedom to read is available. I think one of the things within even our public library policy here in Wichita, the freedom to read, at the first sentence of it says the freedom to read is essential to our democracy. So that really drives a lot of our decision making, our efforts at access. I think that the controversies of the written word have existed since the written word's been there. I think the Bible is a banned book, for example, for its overt religious themes. There's been countless times where artists have been silenced because they've been rocking the politics or sharing concepts or celebrations of different perspectives. So thinking about World War II and Nazi Germany and literally burning books that were written by Jewish writers and artists. That's really something that's actually got me shivering right now. I came back from lunch this afternoon. Sorry, I'm blathering, but I came back from lunch this afternoon and I work at the Advanced Learning Library. And outside the Advanced Learning Library, there are these scrolls of art, ceramic art. And of the authors that are among those 10, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 represent individuals who have been banned for any number of reasons. Anne Frank, thinking about the Nazi Germany era and oppression of and persecution of Jewish individuals. John Steinbeck, Dr. Seuss has been banned, and actually he's got a little controversy surrounding him these days as far as racial overtones, but Pablo Neruda, Gabriel Garcia Marquez, and Maya Angelou. So I love that our public library here in Wichita is, we've got our arms wrapped around it, and it's at the entrance of our facility. So.
It's really interesting to think about, you very plainly said that, you want to kind of be embracing books that push society's buttons. And so that's something, you're very, very actively doing. And it is interesting to think that these works of literature that had been controversial back in whatever year now stand as some of the most, well, I don't know what you would call them. What would you say that, that these are important works for us in the fullness of time?
Yeah, I think over time, it's like whatever's edgy today may very well become a classic in the future, right? To Kill a Mockingbird. I mean, just countless examples of books that changed the way that people think about humanity. That kind of resounding understanding that we are all different, but we're all rooted in the same, which is that there's freedoms of speech, there's constitutional rights, there are things really to protect any kind of threat to the freedom of speech or even freedom of choice, right?
Thank you, Jamie. Steve, I'd like to dig more into how we got to this point. As an educator, what has changed over the last few years specifically that you've seen kind of leading us into the situation that we're in now?
I think there's, I think politically there's a lot of antipathy for public education. And I think that's part of it. I see a lot of fear and a lot of opportunism in a lot of the attempts to ban books. Fear in that sometimes when things are changing, and regardless of whatever position you take on health actions when you're dealing with a pandemic, I think that since the pandemic, a lot of opportunities have been grabbed by parents and political figures in order to then vilify the public schools and the things that public schools teach. And I think that fear and opportunism are pretty lethal combination. It's hard to say. I think we're still really early in the process of this kind of new round of attacking books in schools. And so it's hard to say how it's all going to turn out. I think one thing that often happens is a book or a series of books or a set of books gets a lot of attention for whatever it represents. And then over time, it's kind of quietly added back to the list, or it's, move on to something else. And so it's hard to say exactly how that's going to come down. I guess I'm more concerned as an educator with whole lists of books that are then turned into an enemy. And I'm really concerned, especially since books are so frequently a method of affirmation for students who really need affirmation, because they may not be getting that affirmation through other media, whether it's, TV or movies or even video games. Those books provide that kind of affirmation and understanding for kids to figure out their identities and understand who they are and how they relate to the rest of the world. And I am quite afraid, especially when a lot of students are really vulnerable post-pandemic. There's been a lot of difficulty reintegrating into some kind of socialization, that with the absence of books that affirm those identities could be really harmful.
Thank you, Steve. Suzanne, can you kind of set the stage for us here? We're kind of finishing to set this picture up here. What are we looking at right now? What are the biggest book challenges that we've seen recently? Kind of just give us an overview of what's happening now.
Well, there's a lot happening. Can you hear me okay? First of all, I had some technology difficulties, so I'm back on my phone, sorry. No, there's what's happening, a few months back in Texas, a lawmaker came out with a list of hundreds of books that he said, should not be in school libraries for any number of reasons. In the last 4 or 5 months, the number of challenges in school districts all across the nation is way up. The American Library Association tracks it. PEN America, a free speech group, advocacy group, is tracking it and keeping a real close eye on it. Right here in Kansas, we've had several cases recently of, maybe one or two parents, maybe a group of parents raising objections about a certain title, and it escalating to the point where, it may not have escalated before. It's getting to sort of school board levels, and we have seen some books actually pulled, off the shelves, pulled out of circulation. What we're seeing is the same as Steve mentioned, these lists of, controversial titles, and they're just sort of being batch criticized. And then, sort of wholesale, we need to take them off the shelves until we can really look into them more, check our vetting processes, things like that. So we've had cases in Derby and Newton and Salina. I mean, basically wherever there's a school district, there are, some folks raising questions about it right now.
Jamie, the American Library Association has an annual top 10 most challenged books list. Can you give us a peek at some of the most notable books over time, maybe the most recent ones, and also describe why these books are being banned or challenged?
I think overwhelmingly from what's been what's in our landscape, it's in instances where publications are representing multicultural points of view, diversity, and sexual identity. I think those are the prominent themes that we're seeing. So this last year in 2021, Genderqueer was the #1 banned book. And the reason it was because it's LGBTQIA content. In addition, Jonathan Evison's Lawn Boy, George Johnson's All Boys Aren't Blue, Ashley Hope Perez, Out of Darkness. And the reason that was banned, it was considered sexually explicit because it was depicting abuse. And we know that that's something that unfortunately does happen in our society. And perhaps this book, if encountered by someone who also is experiencing abuse, might find some strength, right? The Hate U Give continues to be on lists because of its anti-police message. That's a book that's told from the point of view of an African-American teenager who's seeing what has been reported on throughout a number of years related to police brutality. Sherman Alexie, The Absolutely True Diary of a Part-Time Indian, has been banned predominantly because of a scene where a young boy is masturbating. The Bluest Eye, I remember reading that and just having my world changed, but this is Toni Morrison talking about her experiences. I think the book is Gay by Juno Dawson and Beyond Magenta by Suzanne Kuklin. And again, LGBTQIA, sexually explicit considered. Throughout history, though, I mean, like Of Mice and Men, To Kill a Mockingbird, The Prince and Knight, that's a picture book in which the knight or the prince falls in love with the knight and he takes off his helmet and it's a boy. And that's actually been a challenged book within our library system here in Wichita since I've worked here. Just along the lines, from picture books to chapter books to adult titles, it really runs a gambit, but primarily anything that is hitting the nerve of probably family values, definitely. And I think what's kind of interesting about this conversation is that this writing can compel forward the idea to talk about what families value. That can be a cool conversation. Every family is different and every family's values show up differently. And that's the joy of humanity, is that we can have conversations and be able to talk with our kids about the things that we want them to be carrying forward. But in this instance, perhaps it's easier to say this shouldn't exist for others because it's not right for me.
Steve, what do you feel is the impact on our children's education if such books as the ones Jamie's just listed are removed from the schools? What is like the overall effect of that?
Well, I don't think it's any accident that the books that are being challenged all are, I'm going to say all, there might be an exception, but pretty nearly all, they're either about or by or representative of people with marginalized identities in the United States. When we talk about the harm that comes to students, marginalization is dehumanization. And the harm that comes is when, we're banning books that affirm identities, then we're essentially telling those students that they're not quite with the program. They're not the same. They're not accepted or even acceptable. And I think that when it comes to educational harm, and we can talk about literature class and important American themes, but I think most of the books that are on these lists go so much deeper than that, and they both depict but also engage the empathy of the characters and the readers. And an attempt to ban these books is an attempt to say, we're not interested in engaging this empathy. And in fact, we want to not just disengage with that empathy, but to actually separate kids from the opportunity to engage in that empathy. And I think ultimately, when it comes down to what is the harm educationally of banning these books, I think that's where it lies.
I wonder if a distinction can be made between, because some of the pushback that I feel like I have sensed is that, there may be a difference between sharing a different perspective and actually influencing children in some kind of way. And Jamie, you mentioned values. How are educators able to kind of make those judgment calls of where those lines exist or should exist?
So I don't know if this was directed at me, but I'll jump in here.
Yes.
Yeah, I think we've been through this. So you go back to the Parents Resource Council, and whether we should have a label, and whether music was engaging kids in violence, or whether sexual lyrics were causing kids to engage in sex. And then we've had the same discussions with video games, and violent TV, and all of this. And we've been here. And so, there is zero good evidence that, reading about somebody who engages in an activity causes somebody to engage in that activity. Now, there's a ton of evidence that empathy can be developed for people who engage in particular activities, or who adopt identities. And I guess it comes down to what an individual values. And I value kindness and empathy and understanding and tolerance. And so I'm going to say that I would rather any day engage in a conversation about those things than about some kind of black and white version of morality or right and wrong, which doesn't allow for that kind of engagement with empathy and with differences in identity. And so I guess I don't buy the understanding that just automatically reading about something causes somebody to do something they wouldn't otherwise do or weren't on their way to doing. But unless you count affirming an identity as that, but I'm going to say, a gay or trans person doesn't suddenly not become gay or trans because they haven't read any books about that. It just remains eating away inside the fact that they can't express who they truly are. And so, yes, I suppose a book might cause somebody to be affirmed, but I celebrate that, and rather than denigrating it as a problem.
And I think just to build on that, granted, a public library's mission is so different than a public educator's mission. And so I have a much easier time, I think, in my role than Steve does. But I think to his point, I mean, the idea of inclusion is at the core of what we do in the public library. It's including all information, all factual information, I should say, and contemporary information. And the kids, I mean, we see kids every day craving books that are about them, that they can relate to. And we also see daily when we make book offerings. I was talking to a colleague of mine who works with our children's space. They see daily where we're recommending books to school-aged boy where the main character is female, and mom shakes her head because that's not going to be of interest to him. So he then doesn't want to read about a female protagonist. The influence that parents bring to the table is immeasurable. And it also, like I was saying earlier, I mean, it can create a really cool conversation with a family. It may be uncomfortable to talk about, but the idea of including rather than excluding is really, it drives all of the ways that public libraries are collecting material.
Suzanne, can you get into a little more specifics on the recent local cases that we're seeing? I know there was one in Derby that you had mentioned earlier. Will you talk about those a little bit more, and what kind of pushback there is against these efforts, or just sort of what is happening in that kind of arm wrestle?
Right. The first local case that we reported on was actually out in Goddard, where a parent had basically given school officials, the director of curriculum, a list of 29 books that he or she heard were offensive in some way, and why are they on our can we check our library shelves to see if they're on there, and if so, they need to be taken off. They were actually removed from circulation for a while, and the pushback was pretty harsh from educators, from free speech advocates. It became kind of a national story for a couple of days, and Goddard relented and put those books back into circulation, are still planning to review them. In Derby, it was one title that was taught in a freshman English class and has been taught since, I believe, 2008. And that's the Absolutely True Diary of a Part-Time Indian. Jamie mentioned that was one of the most challenged books. There was a parent of a student wrote to a board member saying, I can't believe, that my child is, reading this in a school. There were the scenes of masturbation. There were, bad jokes, cartoons, things like that. In Salina, and I'm sorry, the school district library committee, which had not met for 15 years, was called together again to review this book, and decided to pull it from middle school library shelves and from the curriculum. So that was a definite impact there in Derby. In Salina, the challenge was about All Boys Aren't Blue by George Johnson. And I just wanted to say too, what Steve and Jamie were saying about, inclusivity and reflecting young people's lives. I talked to some of these authors. I talked to Ashley Hope Perez, who wrote Out of Darkness. She was an English teacher, teaching migrant kids in Southern Texas. And she wrote that novel because she wanted those kids that were in her classroom to have books that reflected their own experiences. So it's very, very true that that authors are finding this extremely disturbing, and educators as well. But yeah, here in Kansas, I mean, there are a lot of just sort of open cases right now where we don't know how far this could possibly go.
Thank you, Suzanne. I'd like to share a quote from the celebrated children's book author Judy Blume. It says, "Let children read whatever they want and then talk about it with them. If parents and kids can talk together, we won't have as much censorship because we won't have as much fear." There has, for the most part, been like a permission slip that goes home with the child before they participate in sex ed classes, for example. But parents, I think, don't generally receive forewarning if their child is about to learn through literature about subject matter that the parent might not think that their kid is ready for. Steve, what do you think of this perspective and kind of juxtaposing those two ideas?
Well, I wholly agree with that perspective. So I think it's important to distinguish for English teachers in particular, or any educator who's dealing with content that is might trigger a reaction in the student. I think it's really important to acknowledge that and to understand that. A particular student, especially on a particular day, might really have a problem, and it's not a matter of offense. It's more a matter of understanding that a student may be dealing with some trauma from the past, and that reading a particular book might cause some emotional distress that they don't. In fact, if I go back to any time that I'm a department chair at East as well, and so I usually hear about when other teachers have to deal with this. The vast majority of the times that we're asked to replace a book in the curriculum or to do something, an alternative for a particular student, it's because the student has asked. Not because the book has been challenged, and the student has asked because they're, very politely talk to the teacher and say, this is difficult for me. I don't think I'm going to make it through this. And when you're in a class and they don't want to have to face that trauma in front of other students, that's sometimes the best thing that a teacher can do, is to say, oh, I understand. Let's find you an alternative. And so but that's for the educational and social growth of the student, rather than the problem with the bans is that they take it out of the library or out of the curriculum for everybody. And I think that's where the ultimate problem is. And so when you go back to the quote about whether or not students should have the access to read whatever they want to read and then be able to talk about it at home, I absolutely agree with that. With the caveat that, not all students have a mechanism at home where they can, talk to somebody about something difficult. But that's something that should be handled on a student by student basis, and not, again, the problem with the bans is it says, here are my standards, and I want those standards applied to every single student who might have access to that book, or who might be able to read and get a lot out of that book in the curriculum. And that, I think, is where the real problem lies.
Sarah, I'd like to jump in here on something. And that is that one thing parents should know is most school districts do have some type of policy in place where, if a parent has a concern about their child reading that book, there's an opt-out. Whether the parent has the concern, the student has the concern, there's usually that opt-out that's available. What we see happening now is parents either not knowing about, not using, or not caring about that particular opt-out measure, and instead trying to, as Steve said, remove it for everybody. And that's the real difference we see this year compared to previous ones, I think.
Thank you, Suzanne.
To build on that, the Office of Intellectual Freedom in 2020 looked at who is initiating challenges and removal of books. 1% is initiated by students, 2% initiated by elected officials, 6% by librarians and teachers, 10% by political or religious groups, 18% by boards or administration, 24% just library patrons in general, and 39% of parents are initiating challenges.
Interesting. Well, For those just joining us, I'm Sarah Jane Crespo, and this is Engage ICT. We're talking about banned and challenged books with Steve Mock, an English teacher at East High, Jamie Prothro, the executive director at the Wichita Public Library, and Suzanne Perez, KMUW's education reporter. Jamie, as a librarian, how do you gauge the effect of banned books and challenges such as we're seeing today? Are there that we can point to that sort of show the impact that banning books has from your vantage point?
I think there are a number of resources and kind of studies just looking at, well, what's the effect of when a book is challenged or banned? I will just say it's immediately purchased more. We get more hold requests from customers. There's so much more public interest. There's intrigue. And as a public library responding to customer demand, that innately means that we're buying more copies of said book, just saying. I think, you know, as far as like long-term impacts though, I think, you know, it just puts even more need for everyone to advocate for the freedoms that we're all afforded. I think we've engaged in some conversation at the Wichita Public Library. I think in my first week, there was a book challenge. In my third week, there was a book challenge. In my seventh week, there was a book challenge. And that was kind of odd to me because I'd been working for the last decade without any like officially kicked off challenges for that. What we talked about in the library board is that our job for the freedom to read is to provide free access to literature, technology, and other essential services, period. And we do that because we're a place to find communication that nurtures and preserves our free society and our creative culture. And our board was really clear that reading is among our essential freedoms and it teaches thoughtful lessons about humanity. And so if you think about like what happens if that can't exist, thoughtful lessons about humanity, it's everything that Steve Mock doesn't stand for. I mean, like, it's not about kindness. It's not about inclusivity. It's not about being a learner and understanding that everyone walks in different shoes. Everyone does. Everyone has different thresholds for everything. And everyone's values are just a little bit different. We're all unique. And that's what makes being a human an amazing thing. So I think that's really disastrous. I would say at the end of the day, if the pressure to remove and prevent individuals to have access to the resources that they're guaranteed, that's a problem. And that means more advocacy is needed and more knowledge and information needs to be shared about the just culturally and societally the harm that does.
Thank you, Jamie.
And I would add, if I can jump in.
Yeah, go ahead.
I would add that a lot of the rhetoric we've seen surrounding these book bans, particularly books about race, but also with LGBTQ issues, is this idea that a student might feel uncomfortable. And I think it's really important to distinguish between a student being marginalized and a student feeling uncomfortable because they're reading about the experience of a real person or even a fictional character. And I think that being uncomfortable is one of the ways we learn. And that when we say, you know, that we're not going to challenge students or people in the public through the library by removing books that might be challenging to think about or that might challenge the way they think, then I think we're, I mean, it is anti-democratic, and it is definitely an attempt to make everybody the same, I guess, so that there's not diversity of views and opinions.
It makes me curious too, Steve, if have you had over the years a lot of parents that have come to you upset that their child was reading something that they deemed questionable? Is this a thing that happens regularly or?
To me personally, several times, yes, but I've always walked the parent through why we're studying what we're studying. I've also I have the privilege in the International Baccalaureate program of being able to say, well, there are other ways to educate your kid. And so if you can't, if your kid can't read this book, they don't have to be in the IB program. Like, that's not a requirement. So they can, they could switch classes and not be in that program. So that is a luxury that, that we have in a program with a relatively prescribed curriculum anyway. But I will say that I have had some parents come and I pretty much say what I'm saying now, but with reference to particular parts of the book, and we talk about the particular parts of the book and what they add to the book, why they're not gratuitous, etc. But partly because of the age of my students, I teach mostly seniors, and partly because I'm in an optional program. I personally don't have a lot. I do coach a lot of colleagues through the process when they have challenges. And please don't get me wrong. I am not suggesting that some students do not need or should not have alternative assignments. I absolutely, it's almost always the first recommendation I make when a particular parent has a particular problem or a student has a problem with the book. Partly because it's respectful of the parent and of the student's needs, but also because I just, if a student is already shut down because they know they don't want to read a particular thing, or then you're not able to educate them during the coverage of that, and it can destroy the relationship between the teacher and the student, and the study of any one book isn't going to last more than 4 or 5 weeks, and then you have to maintain an educational relationship with that student through the rest of the school year. And so there's all kinds of reasons to choose an alternative assignment. Again, I go back to the problem that challenging books and removing them for everybody is a much more serious issue.
I'm just curious to know if I'm kind of getting this right from you, Steve. So would it be accurate to say that it is you weight it heavier that a student would be having an issue with a book than a parent? Like a parent might come to you about Lawn Boy, but the student has no trouble with it. And what you would do in that situation would be different than if it was vice versa, perhaps. And that if a parent has concerns that are just sort of repetitive, that might be where you say, maybe this program isn't right for you. Am I getting those things right?
You are. Me personally, I would agree with your assessment, but that doesn't necessarily mean that, there's a whole community of educators involved here, administrators, counselors, etc. And so I can't guarantee that is how it would end up if it were the parent or the student were saying it's okay, but the parent were like, absolutely not. And it involved administrators, both at the school and the district level. And then, at a certain point, a teacher is not helping themselves or the student in, saying, no, you're going to read this book. That can be counterproductive. That said, though, I have had administrators make up board policies that don't actually exist. So, well, if a student asks for an alternative assignment, you're required to give it to them. And I've had to go to the administrator and say, that isn't true. Like, that is not true. And so I also had to have that conversation with an administrator to let them know that if they promise the parent that, they're going to have to go back and tell the parent that was inaccurate, regardless of what ends up happening.
Interesting. I want to play a 1-minute clip from a Marginalia interview available on KMUW with the author Jonathan Evison about a book of his that was challenged, and it's Lawn Boy, we had referenced earlier. And then I'd love to get some reactions and responses to this clip after we hear it, but let's take a listen to that.
to some of these people's credits, I've actually heard from and they go, you know what, I read this book and I'm kind of ashamed to say that I read it with the intent that I wanted to burn it. And now I see that this is a good novel. I think at the end of the day, they don't like non-binary, non-white protagonists who have sexual experiences at church youth group meetings. And I don't blame them. That threatens a lot that is sacred to them. But this is modern realism. And, my book was not intended to shock anybody. I mean, truthfully, my job is to rattle cages on some level. And there's so many cages I wanted to rattle with that book, wealth disparity, racial assumptions, all these things, sexual identity, but pornography was not one of them. I did not write the book to shock anybody. And it's really not a shocking book, I don't think. I don't think I did anything in there in terms of preteen sexual experimentation, except that maybe it's non-binary that YA authors have been doing for 70 years, 80 years.
So there's a lot kind of back to what we were talking about a little bit earlier, Jamie, that after a book is banned, readership of that book kind of spikes. So I guess what I'm curious about is if when a book is challenged or banned, if that is just sort of a doomed thing, a doomed effort to make in the first place, because it sort of blossoms so much, out the other side. Mm-hmm. What do you think about that, Jamie?
Well, I think that anytime a book is challenged or is attempted to be banned, it's yet another opportunity to advocate for the freedom to read, free speech, etc. It was kind of interesting in that clip. I think there was a real balance that the author was talking about. His intention was X, the impact that work had is Y, right? And so I think what likely happens is that it starts to create a conversation in the community. It starts to create, again, opportunities for communication. And I have to say, is that a bad thing? No, I think that just kind of that introduction of dialogue, even if it's in a space where someone is wanting to exclude material from others, I think that's a wonderful and challenging, but wonderful opportunity for that conversation to happen. I think I've probably had, goodness, in the years that I've worked in libraries, countless conversations with customers about how they liked or didn't like a book. And in those conversations, I'm often able to just listen to their point of view, and that kind of vitriol just kind of comes out. And my job as a librarian is neutrality. And so I'm learning what they don't like, right? For example, I'm going off on a tangent, but for a reason. What libraries, though, are having to do differently today than we've ever had to do because of that vitriol and because of the willingness to say things or type things or chat things or express things in ways that we've never really done before. The civility of what's being said, I think, can create a lot of unintended impact from the customer, for example, to say, and I've had experiences where customers have said, I don't want to watch any movies that have Black people in them. And expecting librarians, for example, to be able to preview or scan or not offer suggestions, we'll never do that. We'll be able to offer you things that you do want, and we'll give you the tools to be able to do your own search, to be able to then narrow your search to things that work in your favor. And again, one of the awesome things about working in a public library is just close the book and return it. No loss. There's no loss. Just return the book. It's not for you. Not every book needs to be read by everyone.
Interesting.
And again, this is the second time I've done this, and I apologize. But to jump on that, I think it's really important that Jonathan Evison distinguishes between rattling cages and shocking. And I think that that's right. I mean, even the metaphor itself, rattling cages, implies that there's a cage, there's an enclosure, something that needs to be, taken down or opened. And I think that that approach to the kinds of things that he's writing about, and I haven't read Lawn Boy, and I'm definitely going to now, but I think that's really different from this idea of shocking. And just because a patron, a reader, is shocked doesn't mean that it's shocking. And English teachers deal with this all the time. We have students come to us, parents come to us with different levels of understanding and reading experience. And one of the jobs of an educator is to make sure that students are exposed to things they haven't been exposed to before. That's how we learn. And so I really appreciate the way that he expressed the difference there.
Yeah, it sounded to me.
Oh
no, go ahead, Suzanne.
Well, one thing I wanted to mention too is one thing as reporters, as education reporters, we're really watching out for is the sort of chilling effect that that all of these efforts are having. And that means that for every story that breaks where, someone has challenged a book and it becomes a story, a published, article, there are countless incidences we pretty much believe where teachers are encountering these and, being quietly told to not teach that ever again, or librarians are being, quietly asked to remove that from the shelf and they don't want to rattle any cages. They don't want to rock the boat or lose their jobs. And so there are people, educators, especially who are really scared. And we think that, basically it could change what students get in the classroom, not because of actual challenges, but just because of this whole atmosphere of fear or resignation, even among some educators, where they're just like, it's not worth it to me. I really, really love this novel. I would love to teach The Absolutely True Diary of a Part-Time Indian, but you know what? They pulled it from the Derby curriculum, so I'm not going to teach it where I am because I don't want to be that teacher and I don't want to be in the news. We're pretty sure that that's happening. The other thing I wanted to mention is that the efforts toward parental bills of rights, which actually had to go in the Kansas legislature, that comes directly out of these efforts as well. So, there are parents who feel like, well, we're just not aware of what our kids are reading or being assigned, and we want everything that could possibly be presented in a classroom to be published online so we can review it. So those sorts of efforts, it was unsuccessful in the Kansas legislature this past session. Actually, I take that back. It passed and was vetoed by Governor Kelly, and they were not able to override the veto. But I fully expect those efforts to come back possibly next session.
Interesting. Yeah, I was just going to ask you about the Parental Bill of Rights. So you expect that to be coming back next session. Are there any other bills or efforts that you think will be coming around this topic, Suzanne?
Well, yeah, all of the criticism about I hate to even say the term critical race theory because there are so many different and mistaken definitions of what that is. But the teaching of race and history and how that is done in schools is a hot topic. And it has prompted, frankly, some of the book challenges. The 1619 Project by Nicole Hannah-Jones is, held up as a worthy curriculum supplement in some districts, and and others are wanting to ban it altogether. So, and that's the new origin story about the history of slavery and the impact of African Americans on American history. So, there are all sorts of those efforts. I think the pandemic had a big part in this, and that is what lawmakers are telling us, what parents are telling us, is that when schools went remote and parents had to be were forced to be more directly involved in their children's education, they got a look at what was actually happening in classrooms, and a lot of them for whatever reason didn't like it. So those things have bubbled up.
Interesting. Very interesting. We have a question from Facebook from Gretchen, who says, would it help to have volunteers available to read and write comments on why books should not be removed? I don't know if maybe Suzanne, if this would be something you could answer, if that would be helpful and influential in those discussions of whether or not a book is ultimately banned.
Well, it's what's interesting is those, those discussions are happening, but not as publicly as they should actually. So, when the Derby Library Committee looked at through Diary of a Part-Time Indian, it was that, like I said, a committee of 12 people that had not met, and it was a public meeting, but no one knew about it. You know what I mean? So until pretty much after it was done. But what's happening, for instance, in Derby right now, there's a group, Citizens for Derby, that's actually now sort of monitoring, has been galvanizing around this issue, and is so upset about some of the things that are happening that they are going to all the school board meetings and they're making their voices known. So basically, I feel like this could be said for any topic that people are passionate about. If you're passionate about it, absolutely share your views with, your elected representatives, with, write letters to the editor, no matter which part of which side you may come down on, because I mean, these are societal and of course political issues. So I think the atmosphere and the, what people think about it is really important.
Mm. And Suzanne, will you talk a little bit more about the Newton School Board's considering a panel to screen books for objectionable? Oh dear, did we lose? Oh, hope we don't lose you.
I'm here.
The objectionable content panel.
What's interesting about that story is, and frankly, Sarah, and I want to tell our listeners, there are so many of these cases going on, it's kind of hard to keep track. In Newton, though, what's interesting to me about that particular case is it's the superintendent who's saying, we need to rethink the way we vet books. And it's not a parent, it's the person in charge of schools. So that makes that case a little unusual. But right now he basically wants to form a committee that will, review books that go into libraries and classrooms. So again, most have these committees. It's just that these are one of those committees that you volunteer for 10 years ago thinking, oh, we'll never be asked to meet. And now all of a sudden they're meeting every month. But yeah, that Newton case is pretty interesting.
Yes, thank you. So I'm kind of drawing all this in, and I'm wondering, Jamie, do you think that there should just be no restrictions whatsoever, or how do you draw the lines between what should be acceptable material for children, across age ranges? What are the guideposts that you would use?
Yeah, I would use our selection policy through and through. That's something that's reviewed on a regular basis to make sure that we're implementing according to it. The selection policy really outlines that target for what a public library's funds are supporting. Those funds, I will say, never meet customer demands. We could always use some more, but I think additionally, what it looks like is, sorry, I lost my train of thought in my plea for monies. I apologize.
Money is very distracting.
Mortifying,
but I guess what I'm wondering is, how do you determine what works for children?
Right.
What's graphic material? Because this, the idea of objectionable content and graphic content seem to be phrases that keep coming up. How do you define them? Yeah. And when do you decide that they're okay?
So I think that's where we really do rely on the professionalism of those who are trained in information science. For example, our selection policy determines what are those criteria that we would choose to buy something. And that looks like professional reviews. It looks like customer reviews. It looks like the cost and how many libraries across the United States are collecting it. We compare ourselves to peer libraries as well. As an urban library, our choices would be different than, say, what's going on at the Goddard Public Library or the Derby Public Library. We look at, the racial, ethnic, economic, education makeup of our community. We study our statistics and what collections are circulating. For youth, I think that we really are looking at the developmental principles as far as social emotional well-being, being able to do letter recognition, color recognition. That social and emotional well-being, though, is probably the piece that gets the biggest rub in youth material. And that's about, again, relatedness. A picture book that has multiple moms, for example, may shock or be shocking to someone else, but it may be the best book for the child to be able to know that their family is awesome, right? Just as they are.
Thank you. I would like to share one more author quote. This one is from Donna Tartt. She says, in films, we are voyeurs, but in novels, we have the experience of being someone else, knowing another person's soul from the inside. No other art form does that. And this is why sometimes when we put down a book, we find ourselves slightly altered as human beings. Novels change us from within. And Suzanne, I'm, you are our book reviewer in addition to being the education reporter. What do you think of this? And to what degree are we really discussing the purpose of education?
Right, the purpose of education and the value of reading and literature. When I talk to these authors, and I know librarians say the same thing. I know, Jamie, I've probably heard it out of your mouth too, that books need to be both mirrors. You need to see yourself in a book and your own experience and to feel validated in that way. They also need to be windows, and that is exposure to other people and building that empathy. And, reading is supposed to challenge you. It's supposed to make you think. It's supposed to give you insight into other lives, other cultures, other places. So, I guess what's most disturbing actually in all this talk about book banning is, although Jonathan Nevison would argue and say, hey, it's increasing my sales actually. So maybe the more you ban books, the more they sell and more people read. Maybe that's a good thing. But no, I think that just this effort to silence books and to keep them out of kids' hands. Also, we're really upset that kids are reading. I mean, frankly, the big challenge in most schools now is to get kids to read and to love reading and to explore and learn through reading. So it's just kind of an interesting situation we find ourselves in, for sure.
I want to offer one last question to the group here. Maybe is there something that we don't hear that much about surrounding this topic, or something that you think people should know that we haven't discussed yet? And Suzanne, we can start with you here.
Well, one thing, and we sort of touched on it, but one thing to be clear that I think people need to be clear about is there's a difference between, age appropriateness and maybe not, putting, certain graphic novels or whatever into, preschool and kindergarten classrooms, and, just banning books altogether. So, and also I think people don't, I think, realize or recognize or truly appreciate the training and professionalism of our librarians. And these are people who look at books with a critical eye toward their educational value. And so talk about, some of these books being pornographic, for instance, which some of our lawmakers said on the floor of the Kansas legislature this spring. Some of these books are pornographic. Well, because there happens to be a sex scene in a book does not necessarily make it pornographic. There are all types of topics that we need to talk about. We need our children to be aware of and to be able to talk about. So there is a difference between age appropriateness, having a book in the right place, and then just sort of, discounting it altogether.
Thank you, Suzanne. Jamie, your last thoughts?
I just think, especially in our space today, where reading is and comprehension, reading comprehension is so challenged. Any book in any hand is an amazing thing to see. And I think that as our adults are paying more attention to what students are doing, it's all the more critical for them to be modeling the behavior that is going to make their children more successful in life. And that's by showing the kids that I'm reading. I'm a reader as well. And I care about what you're reading. And so that engaged conversation, it can't be underscored enough. It's critically important that kids aren't afraid of ideas, period.
Steve, your last thoughts.
I sometimes have told students that that I guarantee you're going to die, and I guarantee that you're going to at least confront sex and probably have sex. And that's why there's so much anxiety about these particular issues. And that's why, since storytelling has existed, that's what stories are so often about. And that one of the things that literature offers us is a way to confront those ideas and think about them and process them and understand each other and our anxieties and issues with those as we, try to confront them in real lives. And it's a lot easier to deal with them first in stories before we have to confront them in our real lives. And I think that that's the value of allowing everybody read what they want to read.
Thank you all for such a fascinating conversation. This Engage ICT conversation is sponsored by Susan and Leon Mader of Mader and Associates. I'm Sarah Jane Crespo. Thanks for joining us, and tell your friends and family that they can watch our conversation on our website, kmuw.org, under the events tab.